A spring afternoon, a quiet town. A blind dog lifts his head across the street. A girl's muffled cry echoes through an alley, and no one turns. But Echo, a German shepherd who cannot see, hears what no one else dares to notice. He runs, he leads, and with him, a man follows. What they find in that alley doesn't just save a girl's life, it begins a new family. If you believe miracles still happen through love, loyalty, and a little divine timing, hit like, subscribe, and comment amen to help us share this light with the world. Snow fell in thick, muffling sheets over North Haven, Colorado. A quiet mountain town wrapped in a quilt of white and silence. The streets, slick with fresh powder, gleamed dimly under the tired yellow glow of old street lamps. It was early evening in late December, the kind of night where even sounds seemed to get lost in the snowfall. The only movements were of chimneys breathing out curling smoke and distant fir trees swaying under the burden of ice. Benjamin Carter. Ben, to most folks, stepped off the porch of his weather-worn cabin tucked at the edge of Parkside Trail. He was a man of few words and deep habits. Late 50s, with a square jaw blanketed in silver stubble and a frame still sturdy from years of firefighting. Since retiring after a back injury and losing his wife to cancer 3 years ago, he'd lived alone, except for his dog, Echo. Echo was a 6-year-old German shepherd, tall and powerful, with sable-black fur peppered in white. But what made Echo truly remarkable was his blindness. An explosion at a training center when he was 2 had taken his sight, leaving his eyes clouded and unfocused. He wore a soft, snow-white blindfold across his face, not just for protection, but as a kind of quiet symbol, despite his disability. Echo moved with eerie precision, guided by sound and scent, and by an unspoken bond with Ben that needed no words. That night, Ben had just clipped the leash onto Echo's harness, the cold biting into his knuckles. When the dog stopped mid-step, his ears perked, breath puffing in short huffs. Then it came again, faint, fractured by wind, but unmistakable. A scream, not the sharp cry of play or alarm. This was fear, desperate, real. Ben's brows knit. Echo growled low, muscles tensing like springs. He wasn't just hearing it, he felt it, without waiting for Ben's command. Echo lunged forward, pulling against the leash. "Whoa, Echo!" "Easy," Ben called out. But the dog was insistent. Years of trust kicked in. Ben didn't question. He followed. The direction led them toward the center of town, past the shuttered diner, and toward the empty bus stop behind Wilkins' hardware store. Snow swallowed their steps as they rounded the corner, boots crunching through the silence. And then Ben saw them. A girl, barely more than 16. Her hair wild and coat torn, was being dragged by a man in a black parka toward a faded white van. Her boots skidded across the icy pavement, hands flailing. One wrist was gripped tightly in the man's fist. Her mouth was covered, muffling the panic that still burst from her eyes. "Hey!" Ben shouted, voice cutting through the snow like a flare. The man froze, just for a second. That was all Echo needed. With an explosive snarl, the blind dog surged forward. His paws hit the man's hip with full weight, toppling him sideways into the snowbank. The girl stumbled back, crashing against a trash bin, sobbing. The man shouted in shock, reaching toward his coat. Ben was faster. He tackled him to the ground, pressing a knee into his ribs. "You move, I break your arm," Ben growled, breath steaming in the cold. "Let's see you explain this one." The van door creaked open, empty. Just blankets and rope. Someone had already called it in. Within minutes, flashing lights painted the white snow blue and red. 2 officers pulled the man away, cuffed and swearing. The girl was wrapped in a blanket, sitting on the curb, eyes wide. Ben approached her slowly. "You okay?" "Sweetheart." She nodded numbly, lips trembling. He said he'd give me a ride back to the shelter, but then he drove the wrong way, locked the doors, wouldn't stop." Ben's jaw clenched. He glanced toward Echo, who sat quietly now, ears still alert. "What's your name?" he asked. "Grace," she whispered. Grace Turner. Grace had the thin, worn look of someone who hadn't had a warm meal in days. Her cheeks were hollow, and there was a small scar just below her left eye. Her jeans were damp, and the sleeves of her hoodie didn't match. Likely donated, but her eyes, though red from tears, were sharp, watching everything. Not broken, just waiting for someone to not look away. One of the younger officers, Sarah McIntyre, approached. She was in her early 30s, tall and freckled, with a calm steadiness in her voice. "We've tried contacting any next of kin," she told Ben quietly. "Nothing. She's been bouncing between youth shelters the last 8 months. No one's coming for her." Ben glanced at the girl again, sitting so small in that oversized blanket. Echo had inched closer, resting his head against her shin. She flinched at first, then let her fingers tangle gently in his thick fur. "Can I take her home for now?" Ben asked. Sarah looked at him. Really looked. "You sure?" He nodded once. She shouldn't go back to that kind of cold. Grace didn't say a word when they walked back through the snow. Echo kept close to her side the entire time. When they reached the cabin, she stood at the threshold like she didn't quite believe it was real. Inside, the fire crackled gently. Ben handed her a blanket, then warmed some stew. Grace ate silently, eyes flicking from the fire to Echo, then to the small frame photos on the mantel. Ben's late wife, his granddaughter. She finally spoke. "Why did you stop?" Ben shrugged. "Ladling soup. Because I heard you. No one else did." Echo, curled by the hearth, stirred slightly. Ben smiled. "He heard you first." Grace looked at the blindfolded dog. Her lips curved, just barely. "He can't see no," Ben said, setting the bowl in front of her. "But he listens better than most." The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a soft orange hue across the wooden floor of Ben Carter's cabin. Morning crept through the frost-laced windows of North Haven, Colorado, quiet and heavy with the hush of winter. Outside, the pines were bowed under snow's weight, and icicles hung like silent bells from the edge of the roof. Inside, the cabin was still except for the sound of quiet breathing and the soft shuffling of paws on wood. Grace Turner sat upright on the old green couch, her knees drawn to her chest beneath one of Ben's flannel blankets. Her eyes, red-rimmed but alert, flicked across the room. The events of the night before haunted her. Fragments of muffled screams, cold metal van doors, and a blind dog that found her in the dark. Sleep had come in broken pieces, interrupted by dreams that left her chest tight and fingers trembling. But Echo had been there, the blind German shepherd, now lying at the foot of the couch, hadn't left her side all night. His white blindfold gently fluttered with each breath, his ears twitching occasionally, as if listening to something far beyond human reach. Grace had curled into the blanket, watching him for hours, silently wondering how a dog that couldn't see had found her when no one else did. From the back of the cabin came the sound of slippers dragging across floorboards. Ben appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing a faded gray robe over his flannel pajamas. His hair was tousled and his face worn, but his eyes held a steady, grounding warmth. "Morning," he said simply. Grace gave a small nod. "Morning." Ben didn't press her. He moved toward the stove, pouring water into the kettle, then set out 2 mismatched mugs. The silence wasn't heavy. It was patient. A few minutes later, the front door creaked open, and a smaller pair of boots stomped in snow. A young girl entered, no more than 10, with honey blonde hair tucked under a knitted beanie, her cheeks red from the cold. She carried a tattered backpack and a stuffed gray bunny tucked under one arm. This was Amy Carter, Ben's granddaughter, thin and wiry, with a sharp gaze that missed nothing. She had come to live with Ben 6 months ago after losing her mother to a brain aneurysm. Since then, she'd spoken little, choosing instead to communicate through drawing, gestures, or the occasional comment when she thought no one was paying attention. She stopped in her tracks when she saw Grace on the couch. Her eyes narrowed. She didn't say anything, just walked past toward the hallway, her boots squeaking. "That's Amy," Ben said softly. "She's staying with me. Lost her mom last year. Been trying to help her find steady ground again." Grace stared at the hallway where the girl had vanished. "She doesn't like me." "She doesn't know you yet," Ben replied, handing Grace a mug of cocoa. "Give it time." Later that day, as snow began falling again outside, Ben asked Grace if she wanted to help prepare dinner. She hesitated, but nodded. The kitchen was small, its counters nicked and the cabinets mismatched, but there was a warmth to it, like the heart of the house beat from there. Grace began chopping carrots while Ben prepared the stew. Echo remained nearby, always within a few feet of her. Every now and then, he'd tilt his head, as if sensing a shift in her breathing. That evening, Amy sat at the kitchen table, her eyes fixed on the sketch pad in front of her. She wasn't drawing, just gripping the pencil tightly. Grace walked by and paused, glancing at the page. It was a rough sketch of Echo, blindfold and all, standing between two blurred figures. The line work was jagged, but the emotion clear. "That's really good," Grace said softly. Amy didn't look up. "He likes you." Grace gave a small smile. "I like him, too." A pause. "You scream in your sleep." Grace flinched slightly. "Yeah. Sorry." Amy shook her head, still not meeting her eyes. "It's okay. Mom used to." Two. That night, the three of them sat by the fireplace. Ben reading, Amy curled on the rug, and Grace seated on the couch. Echo lay between the two girls, his head resting on his paws. The flames danced in the hearth, shadows flickering across the walls. At some point, Grace dozed off, and just as the clock chimed 10, she jerked awake with a cry, heart pounding, breath ragged. Her eyes searched blindly, lost between dream and waking. But Echo was already there. He had lifted his head, pressing gently against her knee with his nose. Grace's hand trembled as it reached for his fur. Amy, who had also woken, sat watching, quiet, observant. The next morning, Grace found a small plate outside her bedroom door, 3 homemade cookies and a note, written in blocky, childish handwriting. "You can have the top bunk if you want, Amy." Grace stared at it for a long moment, then picked it up as if it were the most fragile gift she'd ever received. Later that afternoon, Ben brought out a folding ladder to check the old smoke detector. As he wobbled on the top rung, a voice called out nervously. "Careful," Grace said. "That step looks cracked." Ben smiled down. "You're paying attention. I used to fix stuff like this," she added. "At the last shelter, they let me help the janitor when it got cold." "Sounds like you've got a good eye," he said. "Even better than Echo's ears." She looked at the dog, who lay sprawled across the rug, blindfolded and peaceful. "Maybe," she whispered. That evening, as snow began falling again in North Haven, Echo stood at the window, ears tilted toward the storm, listening. Grace stood beside him, her shoulder barely brushing his fur. Behind them, Amy placed her stuffed bunny gently on the armrest of the couch and sat beside Grace. "I think he hears more than just sounds," Amy said suddenly. Grace nodded. "I think he hears hearts." And as they sat in the warm cabin, the storm continued to howl outside. But inside, the quiet was no longer empty. It was shared. The sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, casting a golden haze over the snow-covered hills of North Haven. Trees shimmered with frost, and the rooftops sparkled like someone had dusted the town with crushed glass. Ben Carter stood on his porch with a mug of black coffee, watching his breath drift skyward. Inside, the cabin was beginning to stir, quiet creaks, muffled footsteps, and the familiar rhythm of Echo's paws. Echo lay at the center of the living room rug, head tilted toward the kitchen. The white blindfold remained in place, but his ears rotated subtly at every sound, the clink of spoons, the soft huff of a sigh, the pause between footsteps. It was as if he was tuned to the emotional static in the room, more than the noise itself. Grace had woken early. She now stood by the sink, arms wrapped around herself, gazing out the window without seeing the view. Her long brown hair was pulled into a loose braid, a few strands clinging to the curve of her cheek. She still flinched at sudden noises, still hesitated at doorways, but her silence had shifted, no longer just defense. It was memory, waiting to surface. Ben stepped inside, setting the mug down. "You sleep okay?" She nodded faintly, but her eyes said otherwise. He didn't push. Instead, he sat across from her and waited. Finally, Grace spoke, barely more than a whisper. "I used to think if I didn't talk about it, it couldn't hurt me." Ben kept his gaze steady. "Sometimes the talking is the thing that keeps it from taking root." She looked down at her hands. "My parents, We were driving back from my aunt's place in Kansas. A semi lost control on the ice. I don't remember the crash, just waking up in a hospital bed with no one left. A long pause. After that, it was foster homes, shelters, one after the other. You learn to keep quiet. You learn not to expect anyone to stay. Ben folded his hands. And the man from the other night. Grace swallowed hard. I was at the bus station. Hadn't eaten in a day. He said he worked with a youth outreach group. Said he could take me somewhere warm. Help me get into a program. She paused, jaw tightening. I believed him. Ben's jaw clenched, but his voice stayed calm. That's not your fault. Grace blinked hard, refusing tears. I should have known. Echo, who had been still the whole time, suddenly rose. He walked forward slowly and nudged her leg with his nose. Grace startled, then bent slowly and wrapped her arms around the dog's thick neck. He always knows when to come close. Ben smiled faintly. He always has. Later that morning, Officer Sarah McIntyre returned to the cabin. She parked her cruiser near the mailbox and made her way up the snowy path, her long coat trailing behind her. Sarah was in her early 30s. Tall and slim, with freckles dusting her face and short auburn hair usually tucked under a knit cap. She had a calm, even voice that put people at ease, though she rarely smiled. Her brother had disappeared when she was 15, and it was the silence of that loss that had drawn her into law enforcement, trying to be the person who didn't look away. Ben met her on the porch. We got something, she said without preamble. That man Grace described, we ran his prints, name's Martin Heller. History of moving between states, allegations of assault. But nothing ever stuck. 2 girls disappeared in Utah 3 years ago. One matched Grace's age, the other even younger. Ben exhaled, jaw tight. But they never found. No, Sarah said, but this time, we might actually have enough. Grace's testimony could help reopen those files. Inside the cabin, Grace stood in the hallway, frozen. She'd heard everything. That night, she sat in the rocking chair by the fire, a knitted blanket draped across her lap. Amy sat on the floor, sketching. Echo lay between them, one paw resting on Grace's boot. I don't want to testify, Grace said softly. Ben, sitting nearby, nodded. You don't have to decide that today. I know, she said. What if he comes after me? Ben leaned forward. He won't, and even if he tried, he'd have to get through me. And Echo. Amy looked up from her sketch pad. And me. Grace's smile was small but real. The following morning, Ben filled out the first pages of the guardianship application. It sat on the kitchen table like a quiet promise. Later. They drove to town in Ben's old Chevy pickup, with Grace in the front seat beside Echo. Snow had melted into gray slush along the roadside. Grace stared out the window, her reflection barely visible in the glass. Why me? She asked suddenly. Ben glanced over. What do you mean? You didn't know me. You had no reason to help. He considered that. I had every reason. No one else was going to. That's reason enough. She didn't answer, but her hand drifted to Echo's head. The dog tilted into the touch. They stopped at the general store for groceries. Inside, they met Mr. Langley, the store owner, mid-60s, broad-shouldered and boisterous. With a walrus mustache and a tendency to call everyone kiddo, he greeted Ben with a clap on the back, then eyed Grace. This your new recruit? Ben chuckled. Something like that. Langley winked. Good. That dog of yours only likes good folks. Grace flushed, unsure how to respond. But when Echo gently bumped her hand again, she smiled. Back at the cabin, the snow returned, soft flakes dancing in the golden light of early dusk. Grace sat at the table as Ben cooked. Amy hummed under her breath, coloring beside the fire. Echo lay sprawled beneath the kitchen counter, his ears twitching now and then. I think he hears what people don't say, Grace murmured. Ben turned from the stove. That's his gift. She nodded. Maybe that's why he found me. And for the first time. The weight in her voice lifted, just a little. The air in North Haven was sharp with early spring chill, though snow still clung stubbornly to the edges of roofs and shaded patches beneath trees. Along Main Street, icicles had begun to drip, and the town buzzed gently with the sounds of preparation. fresh paint on windows, old wreaths being taken down, and banners hung in front of the community center. The school's annual art and culture night was approaching, and though small in scale, it was one of the few events that brought everyone in town together, inside the cabin. Grace stood at the kitchen table, a pencil smudged between her fingers, staring down at the half-finished drawing in front of her. It wasn't elaborate, just pencil on matte paper, but the figure at its center was unmistakable. Echo, sitting still and blindfolded, ears lifted high, surrounded by dark strokes representing wind and silence. Ben sat across from her, peeling apples for pie. "You sure you want to share that?" "One," Grace nodded. "It's the only one that feels honest." Amy glanced up from her notebook, where she was sketching what looked like a lopsided squirrel. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Grace admitted with a small laugh, but not enough to stop. Ben smiled. "That's what courage is, fear with its boots on." The night of the event arrived, and the North Haven Elementary gym had been transformed. Strings of paper stars hung from the rafters, and student art lined the walls. Watercolor landscapes, collages, and crayon-drawn animals. Tables were pushed to the sides to make room for rows of folding chairs and a small stage at the front, illuminated by warm string lights. Grace walked in slowly, her shoulders stiff beneath her hand-me-down sweater. She carried a folder pressed tight to her chest, and Echo walked beside her on a gentle lead, his white blindfold clean and freshly tied. The room was already half full, parents greeting teachers, kids giggling and darting between tables. As they entered, a few heads turned. Among them was Mrs. Eleanor Bishop, the school principal, in her mid-50s. Eleanor had short silver hair, wore round glasses, and carried herself with the poise of someone who had weathered many storms. She had a reputation for being firm but deeply fair. She stepped forward, offering Grace a soft smile. "You must be Grace," she said. "I've heard wonderful things." Grace nodded shyly. "And this is Echo. He's why I'm here," Grace replied. "Then I look forward to meeting him." "Too," Eleanor said gently. As the event began, students presented short talks about their projects. Amy stood confidently to share a watercolor of the town's snowy trees and spoke a single sentence into the microphone. "This is what I see from the back seat when Grandpa drives." The audience chuckled warmly. Then it was Grace's turn. She walked slowly up the steps to the microphone. The lights felt too bright. Her hands shook. She unfolded the drawing and clipped it to the easel. Silence fell. The image showed Echo in the middle of a storm. Around him was only shadow and confusion, but from his chest radiated gentle lines of sound, reaching toward a small girl curled in a corner, a girl that looked very much like Grace. "I drew this," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "because I wanted to show what it means to be found." She took a breath. "I don't know what Echo sees. He can't see anything." "Really? But that night, when I was in the alley, he heard me, when nobody else did." Her voice wavered, but she continued. "I used to think being seen was all that mattered, but sometimes, being heard saves your life. There was no applause at first, just quiet, deep quiet. Then a single pair of small arms wrapped around her waist. Amy." She hugged her tightly and looked up at the crowd. "She's my sister," she said, clear and loud. The audience broke into soft claps, then louder ones. Ben sat in the back, arms folded, eyes glistening. After the presentation, as people began to mingle again, Principal Bishop found Ben in the crowd and handed him an envelope. "Came through this morning. I thought maybe tonight was the right moment." Ben opened it. Inside was the letter of approval. Guardianship granted. It was official. Grace Turner was no longer just staying with him. She was home. Later that evening, back at the cabin, the family sat around the living room in their usual quiet. Echo lay near the fire, his ears finally at rest. Grace sat beside Amy, the drawing now framed and leaning against the wall. Ben poured cocoa into mismatched mugs and handed one to Grace. She looked at him, tears brimming but not falling. "You don't have to say it," he said. "I know, I want to," she replied. "Thank you for hearing me." 2. Echo stirred, as if he knew. Outside, the last of the snow was beginning to melt, but inside the cabin, something new had taken root, solid, warm, and unshakable. Spring had finally laid its quiet claim on North Haven. The last of the snow had melted into the thirsty soil, and the pine trees that had spent the winter stooped beneath ice now stretched proudly toward the sun. The scent of thawed earth, pine needles, and fresh rain hung in the air like a hymn. Crocuses bloomed along fence lines, birds returned in gentle flocks, and the mountain wind carried more birdsong than silence. Inside the cabin, the rhythm of life had changed, but only just. The fireplace, once the center of every evening, now crackled softly only on cool mornings. Windows were opened more often, letting in breeze and pollen, but some things hadn't changed at all. Grace sat on the porch steps, a sketch pad balanced on her knees, the spring sunlight warming her bare arms. Her brown hair had grown longer, curling slightly at the ends. She wore faded jeans and a soft yellow t-shirt that Amy had picked out from the thrift store weeks ago. At her feet lay Echo, his body curled but ears always half lifted, like he never fully surrendered to sleep. His muzzle had gone almost completely white now, and he moved more slowly, his steps deliberate, sometimes uncertain, but he was still the same dog, still the one who had heard Grace cry out in the dark, still the one who had never stopped listening. Amy sat beside Grace, her legs crisscrossed, a clipboard of construction paper and markers resting in her lap. She was taller now, her blonde hair longer, and her laughter came more easily. A deep bond had woven between the two girls, so seamless now that people who met them assumed they were truly sisters. "Did you know," Amy said, chewing her pencil cap, "that Miss Jensen says my drawings improved 'cause of you?" Grace smiled, shading in the outline of a fox. "That's because you stopped drawing squirrels with 5 legs. They were fast squirrels," Amy said defensively. "They needed extras." A giggle passed between them, light and effortless. From inside the house, Ben Carter's voice floated through the screen door. "Grace, you've got company?" Grace looked up, surprised. Echo stirred at her feet. Walking toward them was a woman in her 40s, dressed in rolled-up khakis and a linen blouse. Her hair was chestnut brown, streaked with silver at the temples and tied back in a thick braid. She had paint on her hands and wore round glasses that gave her a slightly bookish charm. This was Joanna Marks, the town's new arts coordinator, originally from Portland. She had moved to North Haven 2 months ago with her teenage son, hoping for a quieter life after leaving a demanding career in gallery management. "Hey there," Joanna said warmly. "Didn't mean to interrupt your masterpiece time." Grace stood, smiling politely. "Hi, Miss Marks. Want to sit?" Joanna eased onto the step beside them. "I was hoping to ask you a favor. We're starting an after-school art program at the library, mostly for the kids whose parents are still working when school gets out. We've got crayons and construction paper, but not a lot of guidance. I was wondering, would you be willing to teach once a week?" Grace blinked. "Me, you. Everyone talks about how patient you are with the younger ones. You helped Amy's friend Cody finish his very first painting. He said you didn't laugh when he messed up the clouds." Grace laughed gently. "I think I just messed up the clouds with him." "That's the spirit," Joanna grinned. "Think about it, I will." Grace nodded. That afternoon, they celebrated Ben's birthday with peach pie and mismatched candles. He turned 61 and claimed he didn't feel a day over 80. Grace presented him with a framed drawing, Echo lying under the cabin porch, Amy asleep beside him, her bunny toy resting on his paw. Ben looked at it for a long moment before speaking. "I'm not hanging this in the living room," he said, voice gruff. "I'm hanging it in my bedroom so I see it every morning." They all laughed later that evening, as the sky turned the color of lilacs and the forest whispered in the distance. Grace and Amy sat on a blanket beneath the maple tree just behind the cabin. The air was full of firefly light and the smell of damp pine. Echo lay beside them, head resting on his front paws, his blindfold gently ruffled by the breeze. He was dozing, but not deeply. Amy turned to Grace, her voice soft. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure. If Echo didn't hear you that night, what would have happened?" Grace looked at her sister for a long moment. The question hung there, delicate and impossible. She turned to Echo, brushing a gentle hand over his fur. "I think," she said slowly, "my life started the moment he barked. Echo lifted his head, slowly but surely, and tilted his ears in their direction, as if he understood. Maybe he did, because sometimes it isn't eyes that find people. It's something quieter, truer, a sound, a feeling, a pull from one soul to another. And in that silence, Amy nodded. No more questions, just the warmth of spring, the hush of the woods, and the steady, loyal presence of a dog who never needed to see to understand what mattered most. Sometimes, miracles don't come with thunder or light. They come quietly, on four paws, with a heart that listens even when eyes cannot see. Echo was more than a dog. He was a whisper from God, reminding us that even in our darkest moments, someone is listening, someone still cares. Grace's life was not saved by sight, but by love, a love that heard her when the world went silent. And maybe that's how God works too, not always in grand gestures, but in quiet acts of compassion, in a blind dog who stopped running just long enough to hear one girl's cry for help. In our everyday lives, we may pass by those who are hurting, those who are unseen, but this story is a reminder. You don't need perfect vision to be someone's miracle. You just need the heart to listen. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Comment your thoughts below, and if you believe in second chances, in the quiet work of angels among us, type Amen in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true stories that shine light in the darkness. And may God bless you and everyone you love.